Hi, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today's video is kind of a part two to the last video I did on comparing. And I'm doing this because I think that there was a comment actually on the video and some different messages that I got from people that made me realize that I kind of left out a pretty significant part, or at least I didn't go into it very much at all, that I wanted to address. Because for those of you watching this video, this is going to be something that is probably pretty significant for you. So one of the ways that we often compare ourselves as trauma survivors, as somebody who struggles, is comparing our struggles with other people's, comparing our healing process with other people's, comparing our stories with other people's. And again, pretty much anytime we compare, we end up feeling worse about ourselves. And so I wanted to address this somewhat specifically and also share a little personal stuff with you to kind of help you see how wrong we can be sometimes, how when we make up those stories that leave us feeling so bad, how likely it is that there's at least part of it that isn't based in truth at all. So comparing our stories, comparing our struggles, that is something that we just kind of naturally do. For childhood trauma survivors, part of that is when we're comparing our story, it helps us minimize our story. And I've shared this before, but what I have recognized over 20 years of doing this is that no matter where somebody falls on that spectrum of wounding, particularly trauma wounding as a child, no matter where somebody might fall on that spectrum, they're comparing themselves with somebody else on that spectrum. Sometimes it might be somebody right next to them, and sometimes it might be somebody way over here. But if this is like 1 and this is 100, even the people over here close to 100 are comparing themselves with people over here that are close to 0. It is part of the minimizing that we do to not have to really face the pain of the truth, of the betrayal, of the trauma, of the pain, the impact that it has. Having to face the truth of all of that is hard, and I did a video on that recently. But it's mostly about minimizing. And of course, if you've watched some of my videos, you know that if we continue to minimize our experience, we can't ever really heal it, because we're denying the reality of what it has meant for us. So that is really important. So comparing our story is not good. It's minimizing. Comparing where we are at in our healing journey is often just not really based in reality, because we're making up assumptions about something. Because we all can have a good day, right? Or a good week or good month, and then we find that we're struggling again. But what we often do is compare ourselves to somebody's really good day and kind of forget that we have good days too. Or maybe forget that other people don't see our bad days. We don't share our bad days. So we're comparing ourselves against somebody that we see as having it all together or being so much further along in their healing, when in reality, they might be comparing themselves to you. And in doing healing groups, this is something that I see happen a lot. And it's really not helpful. And it furthers the idea sometimes of hopelessness, the idea that we'll never be able to get there, that somehow other people are stronger or even more deserving. And of course, none of that is true. But we do that. we compare the way that we struggle or the way that we've coped in ways that leaves us feeling weak or ashamed. But again, we don't necessarily know the whole story. We're comparing a good day for them or a success for them that they're able to share with our lowest days. Again, we can forget that we've had some good days too. So this constant comparing is something that is present quite often in this healing journey. Being aware of how often you're doing that is really important, because when you realize that you're doing that and you can do some reality testing against what you're actually saying about that other person or their experience, then you get to realize that maybe what you're seeing about this person isn't the whole picture. And it's important that we see and understand that there is a whole picture. Another quote that I really like in this regard, and Steve Furtek, I think is the person's name, and I don't know that I'll be able to say the quote exactly, but part of the reason that we struggle is because we are comparing our behind the scenes with everybody else's highlight reel. Think about that for a moment. That's exactly what we do. Everything that I just laid out is that. And if you've been following me for a while, some of you may have heard this before, but the way that we can compare ourselves really is so incredibly powerful. And as I shared with you last time, sometimes the people that we're comparing ourselves to or against, they're actually comparing themselves against us. And I have a couple of examples that they're different examples, but I think are really kind of powerful examples to consider. And they're different examples, but years ago when I was working in the First Rape Crisis Center, and at that point, obviously I had finished graduate school, and this was not my first job, but it was pretty early on after graduate school. I hadn't yet had enough experience to be licensed. I did get my license while I was there, so I think it probably happened after I got my license, my clinical license. But I was having a conversation one day. So my Rape Crisis Center was also a domestic violence shelter. We provided services, we had different departments, and we worked with elder abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault. And I was talking to the house manager for the domestic violence shelter. And we were having a conversation, and we had spoken several times, not really about anything too personal, but we chatted several times. And she shared with me one day that she was considering going back to school. And anytime I hear somebody talk about that as an adult, and especially if they've, already have a family, or they've been in their career for a while, or have just kind of held themselves back because they didn't feel like they could do it, it's always a conversation I love having. And she was sharing with me about that, and I was really encouraging her to do it. And I don't remember exactly what I said to her, but I shared with her how nervous I was when I went back. And I don't remember how I said it, but I think I talked about the idea of being afraid that I wasn't going to be able to do it. And she was surprised, and it was surprising to me to hear everything that she had to say. But so she had known of me more than she probably knew me personally. So she had seen me around, she knew what my role was, she had seen me come and go from the center, and we chatted, but we didn't really necessarily talk about a lot of personal stuff. And so as I was sharing this with her, part of what I shared was also my upbringing in terms of growing up in poverty and having to take out student loans. That's how we ended up talking about that. But she shared with me how surprised she was by that. And that in the time that she had known me, that she assumed some things about me. And I was grateful to her for sharing with me what she assumed. And I was really, honestly, kind of shocked because the things that she assumed was not my lived reality. But in her mind, she could never see herself in me because she saw me as being so different. She said that she assumed because of the way that I dressed and my car. Now, keep in mind, the way that I dressed, I bought clothes from, at that time, I think I was wearing a lot of clothes from like the Limited, if you're familiar with the Limited. Haven't bought clothes from there for a long time, but at that time, this was in very early 2000. So it wasn't like wearing designer clothes or anything like that. And my car was an SUV, but it wasn't a luxury car. And it was new, but it was just an American-made SUV. But she made these assumptions about me, and honestly, part of that was that I was a white girl and I had my master's degree. Like, those were the things that she saw: my car, she saw my clothes, she knew I had a master's degree, and I was white. And so she made an assumption about things, and she said, I assumed that you were one of those people who kind of knew what you wanted to do. You graduated high school, you went to college, and your parents paid for it. And basically, life was great. When I shared with her, after getting over a little bit of that initial shock, that none of that was true, it helped her recognize that maybe she could do it too. If she saw me in this way and thought things about me that were not true at all, is it possible that maybe she could be there too? And she did end up going to school. But that idea of the assumptions that we make, because literally every assumption that she made was not correct. While my family wasn't necessarily unsupportive of my decision to go to school, I did not go to school because of my family. It was my husband that supported me, that encouraged me. I certainly didn't go to college right out of high school. I dropped out of high school because I got pregnant. In all reality, I probably would have dropped out of high school anyway. But I went back to school. I started at community college, not some big university. But she made all these assumptions, which made her believe, reinforced an idea that she could never really do that. Not true at all. And it was such a beautiful conversation. So this is an important lesson too, I think, to how we can build connection, how we can really feel a sense of being connected to somebody that we might have felt like we had nothing in common. But all of those assumptions that she made about me were not really true. The other experience that I wanted to share with you was, this wasn't really so much about comparing healing or where somebody is in their life, but growing up, and I haven't really talked too much about this, my siblings were 9 and 10 years older than I was. And when they were, I believe, 4 and 5 years old, my grandparents took them and raised them, because my understanding is that they would have been taken into children and family services. I don't know the details. But if they had not been taken in by my grandparents, they would have been put into the system. And so my grandparents took them and raised them. I came along like 4 or 5 years later, and was raised by my mom. My dad was part of the picture for about 5 years, and they got divorced. But through my time growing up, I had a relationship with my grandparents, and I'm so thankful for that, because they were the stabilizing force in my life, at least the most stabilizing force in my life. And I think that that went a long way in how not only the whole impact that I experienced, but also some of the healing that I was able to experience. But my years growing up, living with my mom, were quite different than my siblings' years growing up with my grandparents. My grandparents were kind of middle income. My grandfather had a very, very stable job, and my grandmother was basically a stay-at-home mom. They lived in a home that my grandfather built, and their entire lives basically. And I always looked at that as, well, in a way that left me feeling so incredibly envious. And in all reality, it reinforced a belief that I wasn't good enough. I compared myself all the time. I questioned all the time why I wasn't good enough for them to raise, why I didn't matter enough for them to take me and raise me. Because life was challenging with my mom. Not that my siblings didn't experience challenge, but as a kid, I didn't think about that. I just compared those differences. I was living with my mom. My mom was depressed. My dad was really absent. We lived in poverty. We lived on financial assistance, government financial assistance. I never got to go anywhere or take vacations. I couldn't do things like extracurricular activities because we didn't have the financial resources to do that. And my siblings, on the other hand, I had a brother and a sister. My siblings, on the other hand, got to do all kinds of extracurricular things. They went on vacations. They had a nice house that they got to live in, nice bedroom furniture, meals that were cooked for them. I compared those things all the time. And my grandparents lived about 2.5, 3 hours away from where I lived up until the age of about 10. And so I didn't see that all the time, but I knew that that was happening. And we would visit my grandparents, and I would actually sleep in my sister's room. And so she had all this really beautiful furniture. And this constant comparing was always there. And I wasn't completely aware that it was always there. But I was always left with this sense of, I don't matter. Because they took my siblings and raised them because of the conditions that they were in living with my mom and my dad at the time. They were together at that time. Well, those conditions I don't think really changed much. I suspect that if anything, they probably got worse. But I was left there. My grandparents didn't take me. And I later learned some different things. But again, when we're in that place, we can't see beyond that. And so throughout my life, I struggled with that. I compared myself, I felt envious, and I felt like I wasn't enough. Otherwise, they would have raised me. And most years as a younger child, I spent my birthday with my grandparents. And I'm so grateful that I did. And my grandmother would throw a little party for me and bake me a cake and all of that. So I got to experience that. And they were like on holidays and stuff like that. I was always treated very equally in all of those other ways. But what I focused on, what hurt, was that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't matter enough for them to raise. And that stayed with me. And then when I was about 13 years old, my mom, and I was living with my mom at the time, my mom moved further out away from my friends and my boyfriend at the time. And that was really hard. Sometimes we had a car, sometimes we didn't, but I was kind of trapped out there. I still did go to school, the same school, as long as I had transportation, but I didn't get to spend time with my friends like I would have before. And I remember, and this was so hard for me to do, I actually asked my grandmother if I could stay with them. I was incredibly vulnerable, and her answer was no. And I still remember what that felt like. And I don't remember exactly. She gave me a reason, I think, and I don't know what the reason was, but it didn't matter. In that moment, I just heard no, which absolutely was irrefutable proof that it was about me, that I didn't matter enough. And that was hard. I never asked again. But in that moment, I made that comparison again. And at that point, my brother and sister were both out of the home. So it was just my grandparents, because they were adults and had moved on. But she said no, and I was devastated. I was absolutely devastated. I was upset that I couldn't live with them, because they lived by near, where my friends and everybody lived. So that was difficult, but it was also incredibly difficult because then I had new proof of what I had always believed. And I want to be clear that, again, I don't remember what her reason was, but there was a lot of good that came from my grandparents. Really, I think if it had not been for my grandparents, I could have ended up in a lot worse place than I did. But again, at that time, it just didn't matter. So jumping ahead many years later, it was actually as my grandfather was dying. So let's see, at 13, just thinking about what year that would have been. So my gosh, 20 years later, about 20 years later, I guess, my grandmother had just died. My grandfather was dying. And my sister and I were at the nursing home, and he was sleeping. And we were talking, and I don't remember how the conversation came up, but I had found myself thinking about this at different times. The thought would come to mind, and then it would kind of go away. And that thought was, I wonder how it was for my siblings to not be raised by our mom. But then I would go to, but they had a much better life than I did, so it couldn't be that bad. So it was kind of this back and forth. But I did have that awareness, like, I wonder how this might have affected them. And this would have been, so in 2003, I had finished my graduate program just a few years before, and I was still working actually at that rape crisis center. Or actually, when they died, I had just left the rape crisis center. Sorry. But I was having those thoughts. But again, I would jump to, well, but they had this, great life with my grandparents. And I said to my sister, we were having this conversation, and I don't remember what I said to her, but she affirmed what I had been wondering. And she became emotional and felt that she wasn't good enough because my mom didn't keep her. So throughout her life, she felt envious of me because my mom kept her in her mind. And in reality, my grandmother actually shared this with me, that she told my mom when my mom was pregnant with me that she wasn't taking another one of her children, that she had to raise me. But my sister didn't know that. In my sister's experience, in her hurt, in her comparing, she saw that my mom chose to keep me and not send me off to my grandparents. But for me, it was that my grandparents didn't choose me. And we both have very valid reasons for feeling that way. It makes sense that she would feel abandoned by our mom. It absolutely makes sense. And though her life, I do believe, was probably better in pretty much every way, being raised by our grandparents, that's the thing that hurt. That was a huge wound for her. And in all reality, me staying with my mom was a wound for me. So the very exact thing wounded each of us in different ways. And when we're in that place of comparing our stories, our struggles, our journey, and our process, that's what we get caught up in. That's what we hold on to as proof of the thing that we already believe, or the fear that we've been holding on to. My sister and I had a good conversation that day. And while it didn't ultimately change anything, I think it did help each of us see, really understand, not just the other person, but the truth of our own experience. And that can be important. So when you find yourself comparing to somebody else, whether it's looking at somebody and thinking how great their life is, or how strong they are, or how much better they are in some way, know that that comparison is based on a story that you're telling yourself. Even if there are some pieces of truth to that, just like there are pieces of truth, right, to the fact that my mom raised me and she didn't raise my sister. But that's not the whole story. It is true that my grandparents agreed to raise my siblings and gave them a great life. But that's not the whole story of their experience, is it? My sister lived with feeling that she wasn't enough for my mom to want to fight for. And we all have those kinds of experiences. Of course, it's not going to be exactly the same, but we do that, and we do it with our siblings. Even when we grow up in a pretty good home and we're close to our siblings, the way that we compare ourselves with our siblings can be really impactful on our lives, even in the best circumstances. But so often we make assumptions about it that are not based in truth. So when you find yourself making those kinds of comparisons about your struggle, about your healing process, two things to keep in mind. One, you're probably not seeing the whole picture. And two, that even if you are seeing a lot of that picture, that what you're focused on is the highlight reel, so to speak. Recognizing that everybody has the other side too. We all have the difficulty and the struggle and the things that other people don't really see. And I've experienced that a lot with clients over the years, making assumptions about my life. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can create difficulty because it's easy then to say, well, she won't understand, or she'll judge me. She can't know what that's like. And it's one of the reasons that very early on in my work, I started sharing my educational process journey with people, because it helped them recognize that we can feel terrified, we can feel completely incapable, and it not be true. So I shared my experience of dropping out of high school, being pregnant at 16, and going on later to get my master's degree. I shared that with people a lot because that was something that came up over and over again. People wanting to do something but holding themselves back. And I think that this is part of the reason too why we don't have to do it publicly, but sharing our stories with people. Not just the highlights, but the behind the scenes, the messy stuff, the difficult stuff, the struggles. Because we all experience both. Every one of us does. But when we only focus on those highlights, when we only focus on those things that we think sets us so far apart, it's really hard to ever feel like we can be there too. But you can. You just have to be able to begin to believe it. Thank you for watching. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer related to my journey, mental health, trauma, healing, please share it with me at qanda@courageousjourneys.com. That link will be in the description below. If you've not subscribed to my channel, please do so, and be sure to click the little bell for notifications. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps other people find this channel and my videos. And if you think that somebody else could feel inspired or less alone by watching this video, please consider sharing with them. So I will look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for watching.